The sun beat down on the crowded Manhattan sidewalk as commuters shuffled past one another, eyes glued to phones, minds lost in deadlines. No one noticed the older man in the tailored grey suit stumble. He clutched his chest, gasping, his briefcase dropping with a loud thud that echoed briefly, and then was drowned out by the noise of the city. He collapsed onto the pavement, his body rigid, eyes wide with pain. People passed by, pausing just long enough to glance, then kept walking. No one wanted to get involved. In a world where kindness was often buried beneath suspicion and speed, compassion was a rarity. But then, someone stopped. Maya Turner, a young woman in her early 30s with a worn-out tote bag and scuffed sneakers, halted mid-step. She hesitated. She had her own problems, an eviction notice folded in her back pocket and a job interview in 30 minutes. But something in her heart wouldn't let her pass. She rushed to the man's side. "Sir, can you hear me?" No response. His breathing was shallow, face pale. She pulled out her phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers, trying to remember what to do from those first aid classes she'd taken years ago. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Help is coming." As the sirens wailed in the distance, the crowd watched from afar. But none approached, only Maya. She had no idea that this man, unconscious and anonymous to her, was none other than Richard Vance, the feared billionaire tycoon known more for firing entire departments than for showing a single sign of human vulnerability. And this moment, this choice to help, would change everything. Maya didn't recognize him. To her, he was just a man in need, vulnerable, fragile, and human. She stayed kneeling beside him as the ambulance pulled up, paramedics rushing with urgency. One of them, a tall, no-nonsense woman, asked quickly, "You're a relative?" Maya shook her head. "No, I just found him like this." He collapsed. They took over, checking vitals, lifting the man gently onto a stretcher. One of the paramedics looked at her. "You probably saved his life." Maya nodded, dazed. She hadn't thought about it like that. She had just acted. As they loaded the unconscious man into the ambulance, one of the EMTs turned to her. "You coming with us?" Maya blinked. "Am I allowed?" He shrugged. "You found him. Might be good for the hospital staff to know what happened." So she climbed in. Inside the ambulance, she sat quietly while they worked on him. He looked oddly peaceful now, despite the wires and oxygen mask. She studied his face. Something about him seemed familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. At the hospital, she gave her statement to the nurses and a security officer, then waited for an update. Hours passed. Her job interview time came and went. She didn't even check her phone. For some reason, it didn't seem important anymore. Just as she was about to leave, a suited man approached her. Polished shoes, crisp tie, earpiece. "Miss Turner," he asked, checking a note. "Mr. Vance's team would like to speak with you right away." Maya blinked. "Mr. Vance?" "Yes," the man said. "Richard Vance. The Richard Vance." And suddenly, it hit her. The face, the cold reputation, the man whose empire she once dreamed of working for, the man whose life she'd just saved. Maya followed the man down a sterile hallway, heart pounding. She had no idea what to expect. Her mind raced. Why would a billionaire's team want to talk to her? Was she in trouble? Would they accuse her of something? She hadn't done anything wrong, had she? They entered a quiet private waiting room, far from the chaos of the ER. Inside, a sharply dressed woman in her 50s stood up from a leather chair. Her presence was commanding, elegant yet firm. "You must be Maya," the woman said, offering a hand. "I'm Evelyn Brooks, Mr. Vance's executive assistant. He's stable now, in and out of consciousness. The doctors say if you hadn't acted when you did, he might not have made it." Maya nodded slowly, unsure what to say. Evelyn continued, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Vance doesn't trust easily. He keeps his world tightly controlled, but the fact that a complete stranger stopped to help him, it caught us off guard." Maya shifted nervously. "I just did what anyone would do." Evelyn smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You'd be surprised how rare that is." There was a pause, then she added, He wants to see you. Maya froze. Now? If you're willing, Evelyn said. Maya hesitated, her thoughts a storm. She had saved a life, yes, but not just any life. Richard Vance was infamous for ruthlessness, lawsuits, mergers that left thousands jobless. She'd read about him in headlines. And now, he wanted to see her. She nodded. Okay. Evelyn led her down another corridor, past security guards and hushed voices. At the end, a private room. Maya stepped inside, heart pounding. On the bed, eyes half open, was the feared billionaire, awake, aware, and watching her. His eyes locked onto hers, sharp, grey, observant. Even pale and weak, Richard Vance carried the aura of someone used to commanding rooms, signing fates with a flick of a pen. Yet now he looked human. Sit, he said hoarsely, motioning to the chair beside the bed. Maya obeyed, unsure of what to say. The silence between them was thick. You stayed, he murmured. You didn't walk past. Maya nodded. I couldn't. You needed help. He studied her face. What's your name? Maya Turner, he paused. You don't know who I am, do you? She hesitated. I didn't. Not at first, I just saw a man who was hurting. A long silence followed. Then, to her surprise, Richard chuckled, a dry, fragile sound. The universe has a strange sense of humor, he said. 30 years building walls, and the one time I fall, someone like you shows up. She frowned. Someone like me? He met her gaze. Someone real. Someone who doesn't want anything. Maya looked down. I don't expect anything. That's why it matters. The words hung in the air heavy with meaning. He gestured weakly to a side table. That book, hand it to me. She passed it over, a worn leather notebook. Inside, pages filled with writing and photos, old ones. Richard flipped to a picture of a young woman holding a baby. My mother, he said. And me. Maya leaned in. She hadn't expected this. Not vulnerability, not family. I lost her before I became... This, he said, waving vaguely at the room, the title, the empire. She would have wanted me to thank you properly. And then something unexpected happened. He took her hand, fragile, trembling, and whispered, Thank you, Maya, for seeing a man, not a name. And Maya felt something shift, in him and in herself. The room fell quiet again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was reflective, intimate. Maya sat beside a man the world feared, and yet here he was just Richard, vulnerable, recovering, raw. I wasn't always like this, he said after a while. There was a time I believed in people, in kindness. I used to think the world rewarded honesty. What changed? She asked gently. He smiled bitterly. The world did. He spoke slowly, recounting how his father left when he was 8, how his mother worked 2 jobs and still couldn't pay rent, how a landlord evicted them in the middle of winter. That night, they slept in a bus station, and that was the moment he vowed never to be powerless again. I built walls so high no one could ever hurt me again, he said. Turns out they also keep people out. Maya listened, absorbing every word. She saw now that behind the headlines and the empire was a wounded man who had mistaken control for healing, dominance for safety. And then he asked, What about you? You look like you've seen some battles. She hesitated, then answered honestly. I lost my mom 3 years ago. Cancer. I was her only caretaker. I dropped out of college, took any job I could. Things haven't been easy. I'm between homes right now. I almost didn't stop for you. I had a job interview. His eyes narrowed. Did you make it? She shook her head. He closed his eyes for a long moment. You saved my life and missed your own opportunity. Then he turned to her. Maya, how would you like to work for me? The room stilled. Her breath caught. Why? She asked. Because maybe I need someone around who reminds me what humanity looks like. Maya didn't know what to say. The offer hung in the air like a question with no clear answer. A job with Richard Vance, the same man whose companies were known for iron-fisted management and ruthless efficiency. She blinked, unsure whether it was real or some fever dream brought on by adrenaline and exhaustion. "I don't have a resume," she stammered. He smiled weakly. "I think I've seen the most important part." Evelyn, who had re-entered quietly, nodded in agreement. "We can handle paperwork later. Right now he needs rest. But if you're open to it, there's a place for you." Maya stood slowly. "I don't know what I could possibly offer someone like you." Richard's voice was firm despite his weakened state. "Honesty, integrity, empathy, the things no one around me has had in years." Maya gave a faint, disbelieving laugh. "I don't know anything about business." He looked at her. "That's exactly why I want you." She left the hospital that day in a daze. The city looked different, louder, sharper, but she felt lighter, like something in her had shifted, like the universe had tilted just slightly in her favor for the first time in years. 2 days later, a black car pulled up to the small shelter where she was staying. Evelyn stepped out, holding an envelope. "Your offer letter," she said simply, "and an advance. Richard insists." Inside the envelope was a formal job offer, advisor to the Office of the CEO, Human Experience Division, and beneath it, a personal note handwritten by Richard himself. "Let's build something better, together. R." Maya wiped her eyes. For the first time in years, hope didn't feel like a lie. Maya's first day wasn't like any onboarding process she had imagined. There were no rigid HR seminars or forms to fill in. Instead, she was escorted directly to the top floor of Vance Global Headquarters, a towering structure of glass and steel that touched the sky like ambition incarnate. The doors opened to reveal a surprisingly minimalist office, sleek, silent, imposing. And there, seated in a wheelchair by the window, was Richard Vance. "Welcome," he said, without looking away from the city below. "I figured we'd skip the formalities." Maya approached slowly. "This doesn't feel real," he turned. "It is. You're here because I need someone who hasn't been twisted by all this." He gestured vaguely at the empire around them. She sat down across from him, still trying to steady her breath. "What exactly do you want me to do?" "I want you to tell me the truth." She blinked. "About what?" "About everything. About the policies we write, the people we ignore, the way this company treats its employees, our clients, the world." He paused. "I want a conscience in the room, and I've lost mine." Maya couldn't hide her shock. Was this the same man whose name was once whispered in fear across boardrooms? "I can't promise to fix your legacy," she said carefully. "I'm not asking you to," he replied, "but maybe we can fix something before it's too late." And so began an unlikely partnership, a billionaire built from bitterness and a woman molded by struggle. What started as a gesture of compassion on the street had opened a doorway neither of them saw coming. And Maya began to realize, sometimes the smallest act, a pause, a choice, a helping hand, could unlock the beginning of everything. Weeks passed, and Maya's presence in the company became the subject of quiet murmurs and confused glances. No one knew exactly what her role was, but they noticed the changes. Meetings that used to be icy and calculated now had a new tone. Richard began asking different questions. He interrupted fewer people. He listened more. Maya observed everything. She sat in on board meetings, walked through departments, spoke with interns and janitors alike. She saw the cracks in the empire from ground level, the burnout, the fear, the lack of trust, and she reported it all directly to Richard. To his credit, he listened, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes defensively, but always with a kind of aching curiosity that came only from a man ready to confront his own reflection. One afternoon, Maya brought up an employee wellness initiative that had been scrapped for budget reasons. "They needed that," she said, "and we saved, what, 0.01% of quarterly earnings?" Richard frowned. "That's how the board thinks." Maya didn't flinch. "Then maybe the board needs to remember who's human." He leaned back in silence. "You speak like someone who knows what it's like to be forgotten." She met his eyes. "I do." And just like that, another layer of him cracked open. She saw it in the way he touched his mother's photo on his desk now, in how he paused before signing things, in the way he started arriving at meetings on time, not because he needed to, but because it was respectful. But outside the glass tower, the press still knew Richard Vance as the man without a soul, and they had no idea that the story was changing, thanks to one woman who refused to walk past a man in need. The shift wasn't just internal. It began to ripple through the company. Maya's influence, though quiet, was undeniable. Executives started reconsidering decisions, not out of fear, but from something they hadn't felt in years: accountability. Departments that had once been neglected were now being visited. Anonymous surveys became policy. The cafeteria stopped charging employees for coffee, a small gesture, but one that sparked murmurs of something greater. Yet not everyone welcomed the change. One afternoon, Maya was called into a meeting with two senior board members, men who had been with Richard since the beginning. Their smiles were tight, rehearsed. "We admire your passion, Ms. Turner," one of them said, folding his hands, "but your role here has never been formally defined." The other leaned in. "There's concern your suggestions may be steering the company off its proven course." Maya didn't flinch. The proven course left a man collapsing in the street with no one willing to help. Their faces hardened. Later that day, she found Richard waiting for her in the garden terrace he'd had built in memory of his mother. He was holding the same worn notebook. "They came to you, didn't they?" he asked. She nodded. "They'll come for me next." "Let them," she replied. "You survived worse." He smiled. "I did, but I've never fought for something like this before." "What is this?" she asked. He looked at her. "A legacy that doesn't make me ashamed." In that moment, she realized she wasn't just changing a man, she was awakening a giant, and the world, sooner or later, would see it too. News of Richard Vance's transformation began to trickle beyond the company walls. At first, it was brushed off, clickbait articles about a billionaire softening after a health scare. But then came the real changes: surprise settlements in long-standing lawsuits, unexpected donations to underfunded schools, and public apologies that no one had dared expect from a man like him. Maya stayed out of the spotlight. She didn't want credit, but Richard, in a rare televised interview, mentioned her by name. "She reminded me that being feared isn't the same as being respected," he said, "and respect isn't something you buy. It's something you earn when you care." That one sentence changed everything. Journalists scrambled to learn more about Maya Turner. Who was this woman with no pedigree, no business background, and no formal power? Yet who was reshaping a titan from the inside? A week later, Maya received a handwritten letter. It was from a single mother in Detroit. "I saw you on the news. I didn't know people like us could change anything in their world, but you did. And now I believe I can too." Maya sat with the letter pressed to her chest for a long time, and still there were moments of doubt. One night, as she stood on the rooftop garden staring out over the glittering skyline, she whispered, "Am I really making a difference?" Behind her, Richard's voice answered, "More than you know." She turned to find him standing unaided for the first time, leaning slightly, but tall, strong. "We're not just changing a company, Maya," he said. "We're changing what power looks like." And she knew the path she'd stepped onto wasn't just his redemption story, it was her becoming. Months passed. Maya's title became official, Director of Human Integrity, a position that had never existed before, because no one had ever dared to imagine it could. She used her voice to open doors that had been locked for decades, not through confrontation, but through consistency, through presence. She became a quiet symbol of the possible, that empathy could sit at the table with strategy, that compassion could shape the future alongside capital. Richard's transformation became the subject of business school case studies, but behind the headlines and the applause there was a quieter truth that Maya carried with her. He was still healing. There were days when he snapped, when the old instincts returned, sharp words, cold dismissals. But now, when that happened, he'd call her in after. "I slipped," he'd admit, and she'd nod and they'd talk and start again. It wasn't perfection, it was evolution. One morning, he asked her to accompany him to a factory site he had closed down 10 years earlier, a place that had symbolized so much pain for a small town. They arrived quietly, no cameras, no press, just two people walking through rusted gates. Maya watched as Richard approached a man fixing a fence nearby. "You worked here?" Richard asked. The man turned, surprised. "Before you shut us down, yeah." There was a pause, then Richard said, "I'm sorry." The man stared, stunned, then nodded slowly, and Maya saw it, the unspoken power of owning your wrongs, not with excuses, just with truth. As they left, Richard turned to her. "Do you think it's enough?" She replied softly, "It's a start." And that was all it needed to be. The anniversary of Richard's collapse arrived 1 year later. There was no grand event, no public celebration. Just a quiet dinner in his penthouse, overlooking the city that once knew him only as a force to be feared. Maya arrived late, carrying a small gift, a framed photograph. It was a picture of that very sidewalk, taken by a passerby the day he collapsed. In the center, Richard lay unconscious, and beside him, Maya kneeling, holding his hand. She handed it to him. "A reminder," she said, "of how everything can change in a moment." He studied it for a long time. "You know," he said quietly, "I still wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped." Maya smiled. "Maybe someone else would have helped." He shook his head. "They didn't. I remember, even in the haze, I remember the shoes walking past. All of them. Except yours." He set the photo down gently. "I used to think legacy was about buildings, companies, fortunes. But I've started to believe maybe it's about the people we choose to become and the ones we choose to lift up along the way." They toasted with wine neither of them finished, lost in the moment. Outside, the city pulsed with life. The same city where Richard once ruled from a place of fear, and where, because of one stranger's choice to stop and care, a man found his way back to his own soul. And Maya? She had walked into that moment as someone invisible. Now, she was anything but. 6 months later, Maya stood at the podium of a major leadership summit. She hadn't expected to be invited, let alone as the keynote speaker, but there she was, facing a crowd of executives, investors, and young dreamers, not with slides, not with credentials, but with a story. She told them everything: the collapse, the sidewalk, the moment everyone walked by, and the choice she made to stop, despite having every reason not to. "Sometimes," she said, her voice clear and calm, "the most powerful thing you can do is care when no one else does." The room was silent, not out of disinterest but reverence. Afterward, an older businessman approached her. "I never thought empathy belonged in the boardroom," he admitted. "Now I think it's the only thing that ever should have." From the back of the room, Richard watched quietly, his expression unreadable but his eyes glinting with pride. The woman who once lived invisible had become a mirror to a new kind of power, the kind that couldn't be bought, but only lived. Because the truth was simple. One small act of kindness had rewritten the path of a feared man and elevated a forgotten woman into someone unforgettable. And sometimes, saving a life doesn't just change the person you save, it changes the person you become. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes in second chances.